Well, hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. I'm Richard and this is Lap of the World, soon again to be your home for road trips and racetracks, as I will in fact have the NSX up at Nelson Ledges road course this coming weekend from when this video will be published. That'll be June 26th. If you're in the area and want to come by and say hi, I think the track has like a $10 cover fee just to get in, but I'd love to see you if you're in the area. Give me a shout, or if you're already at the event, let me know in the comments and I'll look for you. But today we are talking about NSX steering rack knock. And this is a video that I actually debated making and has been like 4 to 6 months at this point in the making. And all I would ask, here we are, so obviously I decided to follow through with it, but all I would ask and implore you is to watch the entire video and listen to the entire story before passing judgment on the product that we're going to be talking about today. Now, that product is this thing. This is an oil-impregnated sintered bronze bushing that was engineered by an Australian owner to address this issue. Now, the issue in summary, if you have a 91 to 94 manual transmission NSX, you also have a manual steering rack. They are largely bulletproof, but as the internal bushings wear, you can end up developing a little bit of a knock or vibration on the passenger side of the rack, the long end, which I think is the passenger side no matter where you are in the world. But this bushing is a very clever way of addressing that because it doesn't require any special tools to install outside of stuff you already have laying around. If you can get an inner tie rod off, then you can install one of these bushings. But where the debate comes in, there is there's a long thread on the NSX Prime forum. I've left a link in the description below because it also includes, how to order your own if you want one. There is a long list of numerous people that have ordered and installed these things and had zero issue, and they've corrected the problem 100% first time, and they're completely happy. That, unfortunately, is where my experiences differ a little bit from, I think, all but one other person that I'm aware of, where we had there was a little bit of a teething problem, I'll call it, post-installation. Now, again, this is where I need to ask you to watch the entire video before passing judgment, because the end of the story may, will probably determine your opinion of this. But, and just to give you a quick timeline on this. So in October of 2020, I had the steering apart because I was addressing some missing washers that I had discovered that were causing some noise. Anyway, they were the root cause of a noise that I was feeling in the steering rack. And replacing those errant washers fixed probably 90% of the clunking noises that I was hearing from the steering rack over imperfect pavement, but not 100%. Now, to get to 100%, I decided I was going to try and take this the no tool simple approach, which is a nice, it's a nice way to address something that may not be that bad, your problem before it gets too bad, I guess, and before you need to either replace the rack or have it, taken apart and a full rebuild done at considerable expense. So I ordered up one of these bushings. It arrived in sometime in November, December, I think. Shipping from down under takes a little bit to the US, especially in 2020. But it arrived in good order, and I proceeded to install it. The problem was, at that point in time, I already had the car the rest of the way apart doing the major service on it, which then took another plurality of months because of part shortages. And I couldn't finish making this video because I didn't want to, make any judgment call or give a kind of final opinion before I had a chance to put some miles on the car, actually driving on the road, before saying anything was an issue or not an issue. That's kind of what I alluded to this in my autocross video. My concerns about the steering, I still reserve the right to change my mind, but right now I feel like things are probably going pretty well. The shakedown that I did on the NSX, after I finished up the timing belt service, I took it out to an autocross just to kind of see what was up, and then I've, put some miles on it since then. But that's a very, very long intro, and I appreciate you for bearing with me, but again, it just needed to be said. Here's the kind of the timeline. Please wait to the end to pass judgment. But for now, let's jump in the Wayback Machine to mid-quarantine, and we'll pick up the story from there. We are currently right here in the process. We were busy wrenching on the NSX, kind of as a continuation of the last video, wherein we were working on the steering system. Now, I could have rolled this video into that last video, but I felt that this was kind of a unique thing. I didn't want to muddy the waters. What we're dealing with here is the phenomenon known as steering rack knock on the NSX. And there's a very technical explanation to this. I will attempt to simplify it. As a very quick refresher from the last video, we were chasing a clunk and the associated free play in the front steering linkage. We tracked that down to the interface where the inner tie rod connects to the totally not a jack handle steering rack. In this case, we were missing these two washers, and in their absence, the threads were able to bottom out prior to this actually getting pulled flush with this mating surface, and that was allowing it a little bit of movement here, and that's where our clunking was coming from. Now, while we seem to have resolved most of the issue, while we were in there, I did want to take a look at one other item. We have a selfie stick as a steering rack surrogate here this time. Have to get creative just for demonstration purposes. But what we're talking about here, so if you have the steering rack housing over here, the pinion would connect over that direction from the steering wheel, and then you have the rack and rack end here that would slide in and out as you turn the wheel. The inner tie rod would connect over here, and that would then put the wheel out that way. We are dealing with this interface in here, where the rack itself slides in and out of the housing. Now, the housing itself is actually the only thing that exists to kind of locate this, and over time, the housing will have some wear, and that will allow this little bit of play in the steering rack on particularly the long end. So that would be like the USDM passenger side of the steering rack. So you get that little play, and then you start to kind of hear it over bumps and yumps, and over time it can really kind of wear out. I don't know that I've ever heard of any catastrophic failure related to that, but it's definitely a nuisance item, and one that I can address while I'm in there. So having detected, as you've seen, a little bit of play, what I can do is I can take a bushing that a clever guy in Australia has had made, and this will slide over this, and it will fit perfectly. This is kind of a no special tools required press fit operation. It's really kind of neat. So you slide this bushing over here, it would take up the space that exists. There's already a space that exists between the rack housing and the rack rod itself on the steering rack, and I'll show that to you on the car here in a moment. But essentially this bushing, which is oiled bronze and has had like actual serious machining and metallurgical work go into its development, will slide over the rack rod and then take up that space, thus eliminating any play while still allowing free motion in this direction of the rack. What happens is once you have the tie rod attached to this, you have the stop washer, and then as you push this in, the stop washer itself, you can turn the wheel and basically use the steering rack as a manual press of sorts to push this into position. I'll put a link in the description to the fellow who actually engineered this, as he has a video demonstrating the installation. So I'm just sort of reiterating what he's doing there, but I am going to walk through the process. So let's jump back over to the car and we'll start with some cleaning. Over at the car, we can see the bare steering rack end, and you can see the gap into which our bushing will fit once we have it slid over our steering rack rod and pushed all the way in. I'm not going to do that yet because the first step is to clean this. Now, in order to do that, I'm going to wheel out what probably one of my favorite and most hated tools that I have, and that is a set of dental picks. This will kind of let me get in and around here and get everything cleaned out. Now, I love these things because they are incredibly useful for cleaning and getting to things or connector tabs that are very hard to get to. I absolutely hate them because invariably at some point in the process I will skewer myself with one end or the other of this. And yeah, if you decide to get some dental picks of your own, the first thing I would recommend doing is taking a file to the tips, because otherwise they will absolutely wreck your... Having thoroughly cleaned the steering rack and the cavity into which our rack bush will slide, and only mangled my glove and not my hand with a dental pick, it is now time to actually slide our rack bush onto the rack. Now this is a very, very tight tolerance, so it may initially appear as if it's stuck, but with some persistence, especially getting past this first little bit here, once it is on and past kind of the where you might have some pitting towards this outer end here, then it will slide pretty freely, but you'll notice that there is essentially no wiggle room. Let me interrupt myself with some knowledge from the future. If you have any issue getting the bushing, like if it requires any effort, assuming it's lined up correctly, if it requires any effort to get the bushing to slide over the tip of the steering rack, innuendo, just abort at that point and get in touch with the vendor and see if you have, see if they're willing to work with you there. The other alternative, if you don't mind fiddling, or if you happen to be a gunsmith, would be like run a small hone around the inside of the bushing, just to get that little clearance there needed. That does run the risk of defeating the purpose of the bushing, though. So mileage may vary. That's kind of one of those things where if you're doing this yourself, expect that there may be potential for fiddling. Carry on. Of course, before we can press the bushing into its final position, we have to reattach the inner tie rod to the steering rack, not leaving out any washers this time. With both of the washers in place, we are now ready for our steering rack bushing to do its magical disappearing act and start performing its function. Before we do that, we're going to add a couple of dabs of Loctite 209, which is their retaining compound. The video by the guy who sells the rack bushings, Les, specified Loctite 601. Just so there's no confusion, this is the same stuff, just for a different market. So Loctite 601 for the Australians and presumably those in the UK. For us Americans, it is Loctite 609. Again, the retaining compound. Could be some confusion. I saw some people just call it Loctite Green, but that is not Loctite Green. Loctite Green, plain and simple, is a thread locker. This is specifically a retaining compound. So with that said, I'm going to go and turn the key on, and we will disappear us a bushing here and see if this no special tool required press fit deal actually works. If all goes well, this is what your rack bush should look like once fully installed. Mine pressed right into place with no issue, and you'll note that it's reasonably flush with the housing back in there, give or take a fraction of a mil. So I'm going to give the retaining compound a little while to fully cure, and then we'll come back and shake things around and give the steering wheel a spin and see what it feels like. So talking to you from inside the car as I'm working the wheel while you're watching the steering rack move from the outside, initial feedback is there are parts of the steering travel that feel, I guess the best way to describe it would be a little bit sticky, which is kind of weird. It's almost like you may be able to hear that where I'm getting it to move off center, or if I leave it in one position, getting it to move off takes a little bit of extra effort. But then once it's moving, it seems fine. It's just that initial, there's some initial stiction there. Now, I don't know how that's actually going to translate. I know, usually having the car, the front of the car unloaded, you could move the steering wheel around with a finger pretty easily. Now it's kind of more like you need to use 3 or 4. I don't know how that's going to translate to driving. I really need to drive the car. So that's what's next. Unfortunately, that means I need to put it back together, which will hopefully be, a week or 2 in my time. But of course, it's like 2 seconds in your time, so here you go. Welcome now back to present day, which is about 300 miles in an autocross into my steering rack bushing experience. things have improved. It was initially legitimately sticky. Like I was highly frustrated in the immediate aftermath of installing it and going for the first drive. Part of the problem was probably a little bit of an alignment issue that was causing a little bit of a dead zone on center, which I think, again, I don't know exactly what happened there because I did have it realigned. I went back and looked. I had it realigned after I put the washers back on the tie rods, so that shouldn't have been way off. But then, I had driven it some and then had it realigned at some point in time prior to going and doing the autocross. Not sure what happened there, but I have since had a legitimate, like my usual street track compromise go-to alignment put back on the car, and it does feel better. So I think there is a bit of a wearing in that's happened with this, post installation. And I would say it feels at this point in time, again, probably 200-300 miles later, with some really enthusiastic driving in there, lots of working the wheel and then just doing some kind of casual exercising. I think it's probably about 95% of where I would expect or want it to be from a feel standpoint all the way through the steering motion. In my case, the stickiness was only actually happening on the, as it was actuating through the last, kind of near full, not near full lock, but, somewhere approaching full lock on a right-hand turn. So when the rack rod was kind of as far in the housing as it would typically get, that's when I was kind of experienced the most stiction in street driving. Now, one thing that I've also done that I did some research on this type of bushing. So this, the oiled bronze, oil impregnated bronze bushings. And what I was able to do as kind of a final step, I guess, is I took the boot back off the tie rod on that side, ran the rack all the way out, put a light coating of motor oil on it, and then kind of exercised it. And this was with the car in the air, so the steering is loose. I just had the car on accessory. So I wound the wheel back and forth, several times, wiped it down, repeated that, and then did it again, and then wiped it down the last time, put a little very, very thin coat of oil on there before I buttoned everything back up. And that seemed to have some improvement because I think where the bushing was wearing in, there was some, bronze particulate that had been kind of left on the rack, just from that kind of, heat transfer, probably of being moved around quickly in a whole bunch. But so that's the end of the story. Is that so? Two people out of I don't know how many they've sold, 30, 50 bushings maybe. Just judging kind of loosely by what I saw on the on that Prime Thread. That was, I think the last big batch that I saw released on there was in 2019, and so you got two people out of that number that have had some weirdness with it. It's not, my car has weirdness with everything, so it's kind of one of those things like, can I personally recommend that you go out and try one of these rack bushes as a solution for your steering knock? Personally, not really. However, there is a body of evidence to suggest that it does work for a lot of people. To that end, this one that I'm wearing right now is not the one that was on my car. There is still, the one on my car is still on my car. And again, I have fully expectations that in another 200 miles of driving, it will be perfectly fine and be, doing its job as it's intended and, helping to mitigate the rack knock. But if you had this happen to you and you have a garage queen that you might put 200 miles on, or 1,000 miles, or maybe not even 1,000 miles, that you might not put 200 miles on in a year, that's your whole year of driving that you're going to have sticky steering, and that's that would be very unfortunate. But if you want to try one, this one that I'm wearing, again, this is an extra one. It is, fully finished product, and I'm happy to send it to you to try out for yourself. You just have to let me know. And I'll go with, I don't know. You guys know where to get at me. Richard@lapoftheworld.com is email. I don't get enough email that it's going to get inundated. The first person to claim it and give me an address to send it to. In the United States, I'll handle the shipping. Outside of the United States, I will ask you to handle the shipping because it can get kind of crazy right now. But yeah, let me know if there's something you want to try. There is, again, a body of evidence that suggests that it does work for 80–90% of the people who try it. There are, however, as a caveat and kind of as my full transparency here, none of this is a sponsored content. This is no sponsored content in this video, but there have been 2 people that have recorded instances of it adding, some stickiness to the steering. So in other words, I think the tolerance was too tight on this rack and another rack. Perhaps it's some run of, particular batch run of steering racks have a little bit of a thicker rod on them, but yeah. So anyway, again, I hope I'm not causing anybody trouble. I'm not intending to create any ill will towards a product that is actually very well intended and very well thought out, given some weirdness that I had with my car. But there you have it. That's the whole story, such as it is. Do with that information what you will, but in the meantime, I thank you for watching. I appreciate your support. If you enjoyed this video or if it helped you make a decision, please don't forget to subscribe, like the video, leave a comment with your experiences. If anybody else has had kind of a similar issue, I would be very, very curious. Or if you have installed one of these and it has worked out great, please let me know in the comments below that as well. But until next time, I thank you again for watching. I'm Richard, this is Lap of the World, and I will see you all in the next video, if not at the track.